Right now, somewhere inside a hive the size of a shoebox, 50,000 bees are making a collective decision. No meeting was called, no vote was held, no one is in charge, and somehow they all agreed. We've called it a hive mind. We've called it instinct. We've compared it to communism, to democracy, to a superorganism with no brain. But there's one thing almost everyone gets quietly wrong about how a beehive actually works. And it starts with a question so obvious that most people never think to ask it. Why is it called a queen? Not a king, not an emperor, a queen. And not just in English, in Portuguese, in French, in German, in Arabic, almost every language that has a word for it chose the feminine. That wasn't an accident, but for most of human history, people assumed it was. In ancient Greece, Aristotle wrote about bees. He studied them carefully, described their society with impressive accuracy for someone who lived 2,300 years ago, and concluded that the large bee at the center of the hive was almost certainly a king, a male ruler commanding his subjects. He was wrong, but the idea stuck for nearly 2,000 years. The reason is actually kind of embarrassing. People looked at the hive and saw what they understood. A ruler, subjects, order, a hierarchy that looked like theirs. And at the top of any hierarchy they could imagine, there was a king. It wasn't until 1609 that a beekeeper named Charles Butler, who also separately wrote a book about marriage, which is worth knowing, watched closely enough to notice that the ruler of the hive was laying eggs, thousands of them, and he made the call. King becomes queen. The word shifted. The biology hadn't changed, only the observation had. But here's where it gets complicated, because calling her a queen is almost as misleading as calling her a king. A queen implies power, implies decision-making, implies authority over subjects who follow her commands. And the queen bee does none of those things. She doesn't decide when the hive moves. She doesn't choose what gets built. She doesn't command worker bees to do anything. She can't. She's not running the colony. In a very real biological sense, the colony is running her. Her entire body has been engineered for a single function, reproduction. She's physically larger than every other bee in the hive. Her reproductive system takes up the majority of her abdomen. During peak season, she lays up to 2,000 eggs per day. That's one egg roughly every 45 seconds, around the clock for years. She doesn't forage, she doesn't make wax, she doesn't build anything. She barely feeds herself. Worker bees bring her food constantly, attending to her the way you'd attend to a machine that needs fuel to keep running. She has a longer lifespan than every other bee in the colony, sometimes 4 or 5 years while workers live for weeks, but that lifespan exists entirely in service of the one thing she does. So if she's not the ruler, who is? Nobody. That's the answer science took centuries to actually sit with. There is no ruler. There is no chain of command. There is no bee anywhere in the hive giving instructions. What there is instead is something stranger and in some ways harder to explain than a king: distributed intelligence. Every worker bee in the colony is responding to chemical signals, to temperature, to the presence or absence of certain substances in the air, to the behavior of the bees immediately around them. No bee knows the full picture. No bee is aware of what the whole hive is doing. And yet the whole hive functions efficiently, adaptively, and in ways that have outlasted almost every other insect species on Earth. Scout bees are one of the clearest examples of this. When a colony outgrows its hive, it splits. A swarm leaves with the old queen. And before they settle anywhere, scout bees go out, find potential locations, come back, and perform waggle dances, precise movements that communicate direction, distance, and quality of a possible site to the rest of the scouts. Scouts that found better locations dance more enthusiastically. Other scouts visit those sites, come back, dance. The dance that keeps getting the most energy slowly wins. The swarm moves. Not because anyone decided, because the best information propagated. No king could do that. A king would just pick somewhere. Now here's the part that should genuinely stop you for a second. There are male bees. They're called drones. And unlike the queen, unlike the workers, drones have one job: mate with a queen from another colony. They don't forage, they don't build, they don't defend, they don't even have stingers. They exist entirely to reproduce and then die, within hours of doing so, or at the end of the season when they're physically expelled from the hive by worker bees who stop feeding them. The closest thing to a king in the hive is the drone, and the drone is the least powerful creature in the entire colony. So where does that leave us? The queen isn't a ruler. The drones aren't kings. The workers, all female, all sterile under normal conditions, are the architects, the foragers, the guards, the nurses, the decision makers by consensus, and the ones who determine the future of the colony. They're also the ones who decide when the queen's time is up. When a queen gets old, when she starts producing fewer eggs, when her chemical signals weaken, worker bees build special cells called queen cups. They lay eggs in them. They feed the larva a substance called royal jelly, a nutrient-dense secretion produced by young worker bees. Any female larva fed enough royal jelly for long enough becomes a queen. It's not genetics, it's diet. The difference between a queen bee and a worker bee is what they were fed in the first days of their life. The first new queen to emerge usually stings the others before they hatch, or two queens emerge and fight until one is dead. The workers allow this. They watch. In some species, they'll intervene if one queen is losing. They're not passive observers of a power struggle. They're managing a succession. This is the thing that took humans so long to understand, not just about bees, but about intelligence itself. We kept looking for the seat of power. The brain in the center making decisions, the king issuing commands that flow downward. And in a beehive, there isn't one. Power isn't located anywhere. It's distributed across every bee, every chemical signal, every waggle dance, every decision made locally by an individual that adds up, collectively, to something that looks coordinated from the outside, because it is, just not in any way we had words for. Some researchers now argue that a beehive is better understood as a single organism than as a society of individuals, that the workers are more like cells than citizens, that the queen isn't ruling the body, she's the reproductive organ of it, that asking who's in charge of a beehive is like asking which cell in your brain is in charge of your thoughts. There isn't one, and there doesn't need to be. The hive doesn't need a king because it never needed a single point of control. It built something more robust than that, a system where intelligence is everywhere, where no one bee's death matters because the collective continues, where the answer to almost any problem the colony faces emerges not from one decision maker, but from the sum of 50,000 small ones. For most of human history, we looked at that and saw a monarchy, a ruler and her subjects. A queen on a throne. What we were actually looking at was something we didn't have a model for yet. We still might not.